Today on Earth Focus, 1/3 of amphibian species may soon be extinct. Harvard University zoologist Dr. James Hanken tells why the loss of amphibians will impact human health. Coming up on Earth Focus.
Dr. Hanken, you're an expert in amphibians. You even had a frog named after you. What's included in the category amphibians?
They're represented by three groups, two of which are probably very familiar to you. One is frogs. Another one is salamanders, which are more secretive, have a long tail in addition to four legs typically. And those frogs and salamanders are found nearly all over the world with a few exceptions. The third group is much less well known to most people. It's called caecilians. These are entirely limbless, mostly burrowing species found throughout the tropics.
Are we facing an amphibian extinction crisis?
We are absolutely facing an amphibian crisis, a very severe one. Amphibians there are many species that have been alive for a long time. Extinction in the history of amphibians is not a novel concept. It happened over the millennia. But what's serious right now is that the rate of extinction of species of amphibians is astronomically high and has been increasing for the last, as far as we can tell, 100 years, if not more. If you've ever held an amphibian in your hand, you'll know that they feel moist and clammy typically, and that's because they breathe through their skin. And in order to do that, the skin is very thin and it's moist. It's used as an effect, a lung to some extent. And many of them breathe through their skin exclusively. There's some salamanders that only breathe through their skin. They also take up water through their skin. But as they do this, because they don't have a very effective barrier with the outside environment, and so they can absorb a lot of the toxins and chemicals that into their body very readily. So if there are toxins or nasty chemicals in the environment, they are readily incorporated into their body, and even in very small quantities. Another thing about amphibians, they spend part of their lives in water, where eggs are laid and they hatch out as tadpoles or larvae, and then they undergo a dramatic change of body form called metamorphosis, and typically then come out on land. Unlike many species, or most species which are exclusively aquatic or terrestrial, they are found in both kinds of environments, basically doubling their chances to run into nasty pollutants and so forth.
Why is this a problem for we humans?
It's a problem for humans in a couple of respects. It's a serious problem for amphibians, of course, and for those people who depend on amphibians. There's not that many species around the world that are eaten. There are some that are eaten by people, and in that case they'd have to shift to some other food resource. Now, of course, that's largely doable. The loss of amphibians is more important because they're very sensitive to changes in their environment. Poisons of various sorts, climate change, habitat destruction, and those same causes will impact humans in one way or another.
Are we responsible for the problem?
We are absolutely responsible for the problem. Just about all of the current crisis of amphibian declines and extinctions is due to human-mediated effects. In prehistoric times, humans cut down forests and modified their environment, but on such a small scale that amphibians really were not impacted to any meaningful extent. That's all changed now in modern times with the rate at which humans are cutting down forests and poisoning the atmosphere and so forth.
Besides the loss of a canary in the coal mine, are there other consequences if the amphibians disappear?
The amphibians play an important part in their ecosystem. They eat a lot of insects. many amphibians eat a lot of insects. So it's reasonable to expect that there may be, including mosquitoes, that in some places people might find more insects. The populations may increase. A lot of snakes depend on frogs for their diet, a lot of other animals, other birds and so forth, small mammals. So it's very reasonable to expect that as amphibian populations disappear, other species in their natural environment will also diminish. To some extent, they may be able to substitute other species, but not totally.
One problem with amphibians is endocrine disruption. Talk about that.
There are now many well-documented studies that show that various chemicals which are commercially applied either as herbicides or pesticides, commercially in the context of agriculture, as well as in people managing their own homes and gardens. Many of them chemically are very similar to certain basic hormones in humans and other animals. And they are so close chemically to these naturally occurring hormones that they actually disrupt our normal endocrine balance in our body, hence the term endocrine disruptors. A very serious one is called Atrazine, which at least, if not still, it was until recently among the most widely used commercially used herbicides in the world. It's known to feminize males. In other words, instead of producing a testis or a chromosomally male frog will develop not abnormal testes. In some cases, the testes will actually have follicles. They'll produce eggs. And this interferes. There's effects on their behavior. There's effects on their physiology and so forth. And what's particularly frightening is atrazine is a chemical that's known to be potentially dangerous for humans. And in fact, many countries, particularly those in Europe, have banned the use of atrazine as an herbicide, still approved for use in the United States. And many of these changes that cause these defects and the endocrine disruption activity in frogs occur at levels of atrazine that are approved for human drinking water. Now, it's not known extensively if there are similar effects on humans. We humans are not that different in terms of our basic physiology from a lot of frogs. So it may be that there's some detrimental effects on humans in the long term that are being generated right now.
Do frogs make a contribution to human medicine?
Scientists have discovered that the particular features that have evolved in one group or another have interesting pharmacological benefits for humans, and in some cases are or were being developed as potential drugs. There were two species of frog in Australia known as the Gastric brooding frogs. They had one of the more bizarre reproductive biology. In this case, the female frogs would lay eggs externally, as most frogs do. The male would fertilize them externally, as is typical for frogs, but the female would then turn around and swallow the fertilized eggs into her stomach, where they would stay for several weeks, developing, and ultimately she would give birth. This is so bizarre, there's not even terms that you can describe it properly. She would give birth orally. The frogs would just basically literally hop out of her mouth. And this immediately raises the question, well, gee, if most people or frogs take something into their stomach, it's dissolved, it's digested, it's used. How can these eggs stay in the female stomach for weeks at a time, and embryos and little froglets for weeks at a time, and not be digested? Well, as it turned out, studies in the 1980s begun by Australian biologists found that the tadpoles, the little larvae, were secreting a substance which inactivated the stomach lining, and it wasn't producing digestive enzymes. So it was inhibiting the stomach activity, enabling it to basically serve as a uterus. Well, there are some unfortunate syndromes in humans called ulcers involving the lining of the stomach caused by among other things, oversecretion of digestive enzymes. And these frogs were studied in the sense that hopefully or ultimately might provide some means of controlling human stomach ulcers. Well, where does the tragedy? The tragedy comes in that the species were only discovered in the 1980s and named, and within a few years they went extinct.
How fast are amphibians disappearing? Can you project a timeline for the crisis?
There are some species that seem to do very, very well in disturbed areas. They seem to be very tolerant of pollution. They seem to be tolerant of noise and other disturbances. They're widespread species. So not all amphibians will go extinct, but there are many other species that either are not very tolerant of environmental perturbation, and so if they are perturbed, even a slight bit will go extinct. And there are other species that are just geographically have a very restricted range. They may be found on a single mountaintop in Central America or in Africa. And if that mountaintop is obliterated or the forest is destroyed, that species is gone. Globally, about a third of the species of amphibians are endangered or in danger of extinction. Might they go extinct? In many cases, they may all be lost within the next 20 or 50 years.
If the public did recognize the threat, what could be done about it?
Because of the magnitude of the problem is so great, And the causes are so pervasive, it's going to take a long time. So I talked about atrazine. Pesticides and herbicides are just one class of effects. So even if we today said, okay, we're not going to apply them any longer, these things are already in the environment. It's going to take them years for them to work through the environment. We're releasing carbon dioxide, which is raising the world's temperature. Even if we were to control everything right now, to shut off all the coal-fired power plants, put everybody in electric cars and so forth, the carbon dioxide that's been released will continue to raise the global temperature for years to come. So I think it does require immediate action, because the longer we wait, the more severe things will ultimately be.
Could you mention one or two things we could do that would bring change?
Habitat destruction is still one of, if not the principal cause of amphibian declines, one of the most important ones. So that's something we could do, is in individual cases of individual species or particular regions that are so-called biodiversity hotspots, single place where a lot of species are found. If we were to set those areas, protect those areas, that would be a great help.
Professor Hanken, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.